Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today I am joined by a special guest and scholar, Dr. Daniel Cantey. How are you doing today, sir?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, David.
Oh, thank you for coming on. I reached out to you probably, a month and a half, 2 months ago, and said a little birdie whispered in my ear and said, you have some fantastic research and I should have you on. And so we actually ended up messaging back and forth, had a really good phone call. You were talking a little bit about what you wanted to present today. And I'm very excited to get into your presentation dealing with Reformed theology and making really a philosophical and historical argument that I have not heard before. And I think there's a lot of originality for the audience today.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of pieces to the argument. I mean, as we're going to see, I have two theses. One of these theses is basically a historical survey of division within Protestantism in the Protestant West. And then the second thesis is a little bit more abstract. It's a little bit more theological, but it provides a new way, I think, of seeing the Reformation, particularly the doctrine of justification by faith alone.
Right. So before we get into your presentation because I want to chat a little bit about it before we even go through, because we have a PowerPoint today. So we're going to be very professional today and detailing his arguments. But do you mind introducing yourself for the audience? I know you've kind of made your round. I caught your interview with Ubi Petrus, and you've done some stuff with Ancient Faith. Could you introduce yourself for everyone?
Yeah, so my name is Daniel Cantey. I have taught at the college level for 7 years. I did my PhD work at Emory. I've written a book, First John, on Docetism and Resurrection, which is not a book about really the letter of First John. First John is a launching point for a series of essays about the nature of the modern world. So that's what the book is about. It's a book of philosophical theology. But I've published an Analogia journal. As you mentioned, I've done the podcast with Ancient Faith, which was a lecture-based podcast. I've been on 1 or 2 other channels at one time or another. And my area of study is religion in the modern world.
Yeah, and let me pull up that the link for your book on Amazon in case anyone is interested. Where did I have that? I had it pulled up somewhere. But just so anybody who's interested, and I'll post the link in the video description. Daniel Cantey.
Yeah, it'll be under L. Daniel Cantey Jr.
Oh, that's probably why it's not coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had it up. I must have exited out. There it is right here. So here's the link for anyone that is interested. And let me add it to the screen so you guys can see it real quick. So do support his work. Go check out his book if you guys are interested. And you wrote this when?
Gosh, between 2005 and 2021. Took me, I first published it in 2016, and then I did a revised and extended version in 2021.
Okay.
Yeah, so it took a while for the ideas to germinate, and some of the ideas that are in there are what we're going to be talking about today. There's more in the book than what we'll be discussing today. And
you weren't Orthodox when you first wrote this, right?
No, the book reads like someone who's deconverting from Protestantism for a large extent. Like the second half, the part that I published in 2021 looks a lot more like an Orthodox academic writing. But I tried to do a lot of creative things with the book. I mean, there's parables in there. There's things. I tried to be really artistic as opposed to just sort of dryly academic in the way that I wrote it. So it's a little experimental in some ways.
Great. So could you, before you even get into it, how did you get into Orthodoxy then? Well, during this deconversion process, what took you from a Protestant worldview towards an Orthodox worldview?
Well, some of it had to do with the division within the Protestant West, which we're going to talk about today. A little more interestingly, though, I was an officer in the United States military in the early 2000s, and so I'm a veteran of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. Right. And so I went and I fought for freedom, and then I came back and I thought, did I just go risk my life for this thing called freedom? And we don't know what it is exactly. Like, what is this thing called freedom? And, outside of the level of mismanagement that happened after Saddam's regime fell, I was left with philosophical questions about what I had done. And so when I went to grad school, one of my main questions was, what is the meaning of modern freedom? And, I went to seminary, like I went to Yale Divinity School, and, it was in my 3rd year there that I encountered Luther's Freedom of a Christian, which became this really just central document for me. I thought, this is the fundamental statement of modern freedom, not a political statement, but a religious statement. And I have to understand what's going on in this document. And so what we're going to see today in the second half, at least, will have something to do with that. I don't quote Freedom of a Christian, but my preoccupation with that document has a lot to do with how my ideas developed.
Interesting. So today we're going to be rebutting a little bit of some of the ideas put forth by Gavin Ortland. And this is a much more sophisticated presentation argumentation than most people may be familiar with, because we're going to be talking about Protestant division, but you're not making the simple argument that sola scriptura leads to subjectivist, individualist interpretations of text, though that is true. you're making a much more systematic argument about Protestantism itself.
Yes, yes. Particularly in the second half, I'm going to make the argument that there is a form of liberation from nature and ultimately liberation from God that is written into the doctrine of justification by faith alone. So the form of the doctrine of justification by faith alone follows the pattern very loosely of the Exodus, except it's now God himself who is the Pharaoh. And in a very subtle way, in a way that Luther, and with him Calvin, although I'm not going to talk about Calvin today, but in a way that Luther would never himself have recognized or condoned, his theology gathers up all of the momentum and the force of centuries of legal development that preceded him and casts them forward towards liberation from God. So that the promised land, if you will, becomes a kind of liberation from the nature that God has created. Right. And this fundamental metaphysical form of division underlies, I think, much of what has gone on in Protestantism, not necessarily as an efficient cause, but as a kind of template for where Protestantism is going. There's a new form of salvation in the modern world that, in my opinion, is unlike forms of salvation that have preceded it. Right. And we're going to look at the underlying mechanisms for that today.
Right. And Ortlund, I mean, you mentioned in your presentation that we're going to be looking at that he makes the claim that the sectarianism and the denominational division that we see in Protestantism is really an abuse of Protestantism. And it's really not a central feature of it. And the first thesis regarding Protestantism and its fruit being one fruit of division, you're making the claim that it's actually, the abuse is universal. And perhaps it belongs to the system of Protestantism itself. And you then use a historical argumentation showing that it's not just the denominations, it's not just the various theologies, but look at the wars. Look at the political and spiritual and ecclesiological divisions that Protestantism produces.
Yeah. There's division on several levels. And, the word that I use is that it is pervasive. It's pervasive enough to be taken seriously as an intrinsic characteristic of this particular religious development. And, I don't want to jump ahead of myself too much here, but, there's a scholar, Hal Berman, who's a legal scholar, who catalogs his history of modern revolutions. And he refers to the Reformation as the Protestant Revolution, because that's essentially sociologically what it is. It is a cultural revolution, and war comes hand in hand with that. I was thinking about it, and the early church and the growth of Christianity in the first few centuries AD is one of the few examples I can think of a form of revolution that did not involve a war on behalf of that revolution. Right. You did have political changes, right? Constantine eventually legalizes Christianity, but it's not like the Reformation, where you have a cultural revolution and then blood is spilled all over the place in Europe.
Yeah.
As a result of that.
Yeah, continuously.
Yes.
All right. Well, why don't we just go ahead and then dive into what you got planned for everyone. So here is the presentation as Dr. Cantey goes through. I'll move from slide to slide, but you want to start on slide 2 here?
Yes, please. So we're gonna first talk about the fruits of Protestantism, then we'll talk about the meaning of Protestantism. And I'm using Ortlund as kind of a backdrop. I am trying to counter his claims as objectively as possible, and I want to be as charitable to Gavin as I can, and not misquote him or not misrepresent him. So I don't intend to do anything like that at all. I just want to say, here's an orthodox answer to this particular view of Protestantism and this rationale for Protestantism that he gives. So to begin, in What It Means to Be Protestant, which is Dr. Ortlund's book, he quotes Matthew 7:15-20, which states, "Every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit." And he's using this as a logic for examining or analyzing denominations or churches. Do they bear good fruit or do they bear bad fruit? If they bear good fruit, then they're good. By fruit, Ortlund understands spiritual good wrought by the Holy Spirit in the lives of those responding to the gospel of Christ and being incorporated into his kingdom. This primarily consists of the gifts of the Spirit, as Ortlund writes. Satan cannot produce virtues. He is incapable of producing joy, peace, goodness, kindness, love for Christ, love for God, love for the Holy Spirit, love for Scripture, and love for truth. Okay, so down to the end, therefore, such fruit testifies to the genuine work of Christ. So in other words, if you have a church, whether it's a denomination or a local church, and they exhibit these fruits, then you have a legitimate denomination or church, regardless of, say, whether they're Orthodox or Catholic or some form of Protestant.
Right.
So what I want to add to that in the next slide, what I want to add to that is the question of unity. So how does the question of unity fit into this idea of knowing a denomination by its fruits? So in John chapter 17, Jesus prays the prayer, what's called the high priestly prayer. He prays for those, quote, who will believe in me through the disciples' word, that they may all be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. And notice there's an evangelistic focus here, that the church's unity is a witness to God in Christ. Going on, and the glory which you gave me, I have given them, that they may be one just as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may be made perfect in one. There's a whole lot of the use of the word one here. You get the point, right?
Yep.
That the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them as you have loved me. And the argument that I make is that if you think about the fruits of the Spirit, they are upstream of unity. Where the fruits of the Spirit are, then there ought to be unity, right? The presence of unity is a witness to the presence of the Spirit and its virtues. If you have the virtues of the Spirit, if you have the gifts of the Spirit, you should have unity. Right. So in addition to that, if we go to St. James, this is the next slide. If we go to St. James, we can also consider his words that the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So you have fruits of righteousness, you have unity, you have peace. All of these things go together. They should be in harmony with one another. And I don't think I'm saying anything that Gavin would disagree with. I mean, there's nothing particularly, there's nothing particularly controversial about reading the scripture in this way. It's pretty straightforward. Now, I would add that oneness of the Spirit, faith, and the gospel should also be a oneness of physical or material reality. If you ignore the physical or material reality, then you're going in a Gnostic direction, right? Christ came with both a human spirit and a human body, and he saves all of it. He redeems all of it, right? This isn't a sort of Gnostic or docetic doctrine.
Right.
And so when we talk about what oneness is, there's a certain physical element to that oneness. I think, when we talk about the wars of religion in a little bit, you would be really hard pressed to make the case that Catholics and Protestants who were literally slaughtering each other were somehow one in the Spirit, the faith, and the gospel.
Right.
Right. That's a difficult argument to make when people are killing each other.
Right.
So that's, a little bit of the direction where we're going.
Well, I love the point you're making, because the idea that the incarnation is historical, the incarnation is literal, and you're talking about the visible unity, right? Yes. So many apologetic debates with Protestants, when you start pushing them on soteriology and the church or ecclesiology, it's this spiritual, it's this amorphous understanding of the spiritual church that has no point. Well, which one is it? Can you see it in history? Can you point to it? No, it's just all the true believers. And that as you said, that docetic, almost very Gnostic idea that doesn't incorporate the material world as a way in which we can see God working in history.
Well, let me add a little bit to that.
Okay.
So Protestants will say, well, yes, of course, there's a physical reality to the church, but they've made peace on some level with that physical reality being divided, by which I mean people not being in communion with each other, right, or there being various forms of schism or whatever the case may be. But if you follow the analogy of the body of Christ, a body that is divided or a body that is severed, if that division happens pervasively and happens over time, is decomposition. I mean, that's death.
It's death.
Right. So you can say we believe in a physical reality, but if that physical reality is actually constitutive of the decomposition of a dying thing, then
Right.
it's just another form of docetism.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I
Like,
exactly know what you mean.
like it's like, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to be morbid or come up with some really some sort of morbid analogy. But if you look at a corpse and it's breaking down, you can't say there, I believe in that body, it's alive.
Right.
You know? So in any case, let's go on to the first thesis.
Okay.
So thesis 1, the pervasive fruit of Protestantism through both war and schism is not oneness, but division. It is the physical breaking apart of the body of Christ. And how then can the world believe that God sent Christ when we look at the fractious history of Protestantism as the witness? And
Right.
how is this witnessing to the oneness of God in Christ and believers in God in Christ?
Right.
Does this history show the presence of virtues that lead to unity? You know, to go back to Gavin's point. So where are the virtues here? And as I walk through this historical survey, you know, those who are watching, keep asking yourself, where are the virtues here? Where's love, peace, gentleness, joy? Where are these things in these particular instances? Because they are profound things. So going on to the Reformation, during the Reformation, the Western Church broke into several factions. These included Lutheran, Calvinist, Zwinglian, the Radical Reformers or the Anabaptists, and eventually the Anglicans. These all emerged in the 16th century. And, you know, there were various offshoots. The Moravians, for example, developed, you know, in the subsequent decades and centuries. And there are various other offshoots that that have been lost to history. These are the main ones. They didn't get along with each other enough to be generally on good terms with each other. There were strong differences at times between these denominations. Luther and Zwingli were known to not like each other so much, right?
Right.
So, and the Anabaptists had a bad run of things everywhere because they had no local rulers, no princes, you know, no safe havens where they could go. So,
you know, in the 16th century too is such a fascinating time in European history because it's also on the heels of the Florentine Italian Renaissance when the Hermetic Corpus gets translated, right? Which sets the stage. I often say on these live streams that I argue that the 16th century was one of the most magical centuries in European history because that's where you get the Paracelsus alchemy and Henry Cornelius Agrippa, John Dee late in the 16th century, and that many of these Protestant nations were also had a lot of major thinkers that were interested in magic, Hermeticism, Neoplatonic ideas, theurgy. That's also right at the height of the Rosicrucian movement towards the end of the 16th century. So that particular century, the 16th century, so many things are going on that are historically important.
Well, it was a revolutionary century in a lot of ways. It's a revolutionary century in many ways. So going on to the wars, because the wars start quickly. So in its earliest days, Protestantism was a revolutionary force that found political expression. As soon as 1524 to 25, and Luther posts his 95 Theses in 1517, there's a peasant revolt in these years, 1524 to 25. Thomas Munzer, a radical priest and theologian, merged his teaching with the peasant revolution in Germany. And Luther, by the way, did not do this. Luther washed his hands of the peasant revolution. He didn't want anything to do with it. But Munzer, on the other hand, led a peasant army in Thuringia where Luther's reform movement had made many converts. So there were insurrections that were happening, and they were fusing themselves with Luther's doctrine and with the religious movement that was involved here, this brand new religious movement. So already in less than a decade, we see Protestant ideas getting joined, and here not necessarily through their own fault, but being appropriated by people who wanted to change society and wanted violence to occur.
Right.
But it's when we go to the next section, when we go to the Schmalkaldic Wars from 1546 to 1547, you may say, well, that's a short war, but the League formed in 1531. So these were princes from Hesse, Saxony, and other states and cities that had adopted religious reform, that is the Protestant reform. They made up the Schmalkaldic League. Although first and foremost a defensive alliance, the princes intended that the League would replace the Holy Roman Empire as the source of their political allegiance. So those who adopted the religious reform very quickly took on a political apparatus, made political allegiances in order to change the political order.
Right.
And so when we think about Protestantism, bracket all of the theology for just a second, okay? Bracket sola scriptura, bracket justification by faith alone, bracket the rejection of the papacy, just set all that stuff aside for a minute. This is a revolutionary movement.
Right.
This is a means for changing the political order. Now, all the theology is there and it's wrapped up in it, but politically, you have people who are now going hand in hand with this and sincerely believing it in many cases. It's not just a tool for some sort of political power, but sincerely believing the reform and wanting to change their society as a result of it. The emperor won the war in 1547, going on. But religious conflict persisted until the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. This is the next slide, by the way.
I'm on it.
Okay, good. This enshrined the principle of cuius regio eius religio, namely that the local ruler decides which form of Christianity shall be allowed or banned in his realm. And the Holy Roman Empire at this point is made up of dozens upon dozens of small municipalities, each with their own rulers. So you may have like a duke here or a small level king here. They're all underneath the emperor. But the idea is that the local ruler decides how worship is going to happen in his realm. This is not a doctrine of reconciliation. This is a doctrine of you and your folks go this way, me and my folks will go that way. Right? So this is not a doctrine of concord. It's not a doctrine of people getting along with each other. This is the initial phase of people dividing so that they can do things the way they want to do them, essentially, under the reign of the emperor, with some latitude for Protestants to be able to worship in their given areas. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's war, and then there's division after the war. That's essentially what we see. Then we get to the wars of religion, and these are a few examples of the wars of religion. Dutch Protestants rebelled against Spanish Catholic authority in 1572, beginning a bitter struggle that lasted until the middle of the next century. In France, Calvinism won many converts in the 1540s and 1550s. The first full-scale religious war broke out in 1562. It ended in 1563, but then came out again in 1567. Conflict continued until 1598, when the Edict of Nantes made Catholicism France's official religion while giving freedom of conscience to Protestants. And I want to say a little bit about how Protestantism entered France. You had Calvin in Switzerland, which borders France, and they would send missionaries across the border into France. So they were missionizing that area of Europe, that area of the country of France. And so you think that the early Protestants were convinced enough of the rightness of their doctrine that they would do something that was risky by sending these missionaries across the border. And obviously Catholics didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that they're being missionized away from the faith. Catholic leaders didn't like this. And so you had events like the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which happened in 1572, where Protestants were just slaughtered by Catholics. So it's really one of the bloodier days of the second half of the 16th century. The English Civil War, a little bit later, lasted from 1640 to 1648, and was followed by 2 years of complete chaos prior to Cromwell's ascent, prior to Cromwell showing up and taking control. We're going to come back to this a little bit in a minute, but all of these are kind of warm-ups. I mean, they're very important, very violent and bloody, although not, single continuous wars that lasted for decades and decades. There was a lot of sort of on-again, off-again combat, but they're sort of warm-ups to the main event here. And the main event is the 30 Years' War.
Right.
So the 30 Years' War, which began with the defenestration of Prague, where Hussite Protestants, and Hussites, they actually go back to Jan Hus, who was a proto-reformer. He was a pre-reformer before the Reformation. He was trying to make reforms in the church. So Hussite Protestants threw a Catholic representative of the emperor out of the window. And this was the most destructive conflict as it raged in Europe prior to the 20th century. So you had these sort of smoldering resentments between Protestants and Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire, which is where this was. But when the defenestration happens, things just get crazy really quickly. So you have Protestant areas that band together and revolt against the emperor. They have some success. Then there is a Catholic repression. The emperor basically says, no, this is not going to happen. and unleashes really, really repressive violence against the Protestants. And this goes on for a certain period of time. And then afterwards, you have the Swedes who come down from the north. The Swedes are Lutheran. And under Gustavus Adolphus, they come down and they wreak havoc all through Europe. And this was in the first 2 decades or so of the war. The last decade of the war, and this is 1618 to 1648, the last decade of the war, things were a little bit more directly political as opposed to being just religious. I mean, France enters for political reasons. And so there were a lot of things going on as the war got deeper and the chaos got more and more profound. But this war was one of the cruelest episodes in the history of warfare, writes historian John Merriman, involving the horror of the seemingly endless brutalities that afflicted Central Europe. He estimates that 4 million died from the conflict.
Wow.
So you have a Reformation. Then you have, give or take, a century of war,
right,
ending with 30 years of just unrelenting bloodshed between the sides.
Right.
This, in my opinion, is one, and a significant one, of the fruits of the Reformation.
Right.
That you have a cultural revolution, the political revolution follows, it spills an enormous amount of blood for its day. When you start talking about wars where millions of people die, I don't really think that there's another example of that until World War I in Europe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's another.
That's exactly what I was thinking. And at that time, their population density was not near the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this wasn't on the Protestants, but like as part of the Catholic repression, the city of Magdeburg was just destroyed. Women, children, I mean, in the span of, I think it was 1 day, I mean, the whole city was just leveled. There was nothing but ashes left when the Catholics finished there. And, again, I want to be balanced here. It's not like the Reformers, Luther and Calvin, wanted to start some war so that their form of religion would become the prominent one, or foresaw that a century later, millions of people would die as a result of this. I think Luther would probably be aghast at some of the things the Swedish army did,
right?
Mm-hmm. But this is part of the history of the Reformation. These things are tied together. That if a doctrine is born out of peace, joy, and gentleness, how is it that doctrine evangelizes aggressively, provokes counterattacks, and then responds to those counterattacks by one adherent or another, such that battle upon battle, death upon death happens?
Right.
If you're going to be a Protestant and look at history, as I was at one point, I was Calvinist for a long time, pretty dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist for a lot of my youth, and you just have to look at this history and face it squarely. So Merriman, the historian, says something really interesting about this. He writes, a year before the 30 Years' War ended, there was a German who wrote in his Bible, quote, "Many people say there is no God, but we still believe that God has not abandoned us." And so the end result of this for many people outside of the death of people involved is that people lose their faith. They don't necessarily believe it anymore. If this is what God does, or if this is all done in the name of God, which is, if nothing else, people are doing it in the name of God, then what are we to make of this?
Right.
How do we go on believing in this God that these people are speaking for? And when you think about the Enlightenment, moving on here, Thomas Hobbes writes Leviathan in 1651. So he's an English philosopher. And this is at the end of that 2-year period where Cromwell ascends and there's some level of order that returns to England. But Leviathan was written as an attempt to develop a theory of state without reference to God. In other words, if sectarianism or religious conflict has become so bloody that it seems that the problem is reference to God, then how do you form a civil society that does not depend upon divine authority? And that's essentially what Hobbes is trying to do. One of the things he says explicitly about the Leviathan is that the Leviathan, that is the king, the absolute monarch in essence, he is the one who has the final say on all matters of doctrine. So the church does not have the final say on them. The Leviathan has the final say on them, which means that Joe Blow, who thinks that, or excuse me, we're talking about England. So either James or William, who thinks that someone has got God talking to him, that person is not the final arbiter of doctrine. The king is now. And so there's a different way of formulating society. At the same time, Descartes, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, which was written in 1641, tries to establish one truth. And if you've ever had an intro to philosophy course, you probably read a little bit of Descartes, and Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, and this is his one truth, right? Well, why is he looking for one truth? 200 years prior, even though there were issues in the Catholic Church in the late medieval times, but confidence in the church was such that in the prior history, it was such that when people looked for something true, they still looked first to the church. Descartes is explicitly not looking to the church. We have to find something true, and we don't start with what the church says. A generation before Descartes, there's another philosopher, Michel de Montaigne, who is was a really interesting read, who just sort of catalogs all the confusion of his time. And so if you read Descartes after you read Montaigne, it really makes sense. Montaigne says, what on earth are we to do with all this chaos and this confusion? What are we to trust? And then Descartes comes along, in the next 20 years or so, and he says, okay, I want to find one thing that is true. Remember, in 1641, the 30 Years' War had been going on for, 23 years at this point. How many?
Wasn't Descartes a soldier at the beginning of the 30 Years' War?
I'm not sure.
I believe that he was, and it was during leading up to the Battle of White Mountain, the first major battle, that he was visited by an angel that set him on the course to develop his philosophy.
Interesting. Man, that's quite a claim. That is quite a claim. So I want to talk for just a minute about Gavin Ortland at this point, because Ortland, he points out Cyril Lucaris, who was I believe he was the bishop, or the Archbishop of Constantinople, or the Bishop of Constantinople, who had Calvinist leanings, who was of this same era, right? So like 1620s, 1630s, Cyril Lucaris is there. And I think this is really emblematic of what Gavin is doing versus the tide that he is swimming against. The modern tide against Protestantism, or the anxiety about division, in my opinion, springs to no small extent from this era where things were breaking down. Protestants and Catholics are killing each other. Philosophers are looking for different ways to form a society. Like, Cyril Lucaris is not the main point of this particular era. Okay. He is a sort of one-off Orthodox bishop who liked Calvinism. He studied in, I believe he studied in Holland or in England, spent some time there, got influenced, and went back to Jerusalem. And he's not emblematic at all of the Orthodox tradition. But these wars are emblematic of the history of Protestantism that has been handed down to us, right, and the social order that has been handed down to us as a result. So, all right. So moving on from war to schism. Okay, so we're going to jump around a little bit here. We go to the First Great Awakening, which is the late 1730s, early 1740s in the United States of America. So this was the time of Gilbert Tennent. He was a Presbyterian preacher in the Middle Colonies. So think like Delaware, New Jersey, that area, right? There were two factions among the Presbyterians at this time in his local area. There was the New Side, and Tennent was one of the members of the New Side. And they preached an emotional appropriation of grace that was exuberant, if not violent, with groaning, crying, and disturbances during worship. So think to yourself, like, not exactly the extremes of Pentecostalism, but definitely getting there.
Moving in that direction for sure.
Yes, moving in that direction for sure. But this was supposed to be the experience of grace. This is how you knew the Holy Spirit was moving in your heart, is that you had some kind of experience along this line. So they're on one side, and then you have the old side who criticized this experience as inauthentic and considered grace as conducive to peace. So in other words, you've got the people who think, we're going to start a moral reformation. The way we do that is we get people to experience grace in the heart. And how do we know they're experiencing grace in the heart? Well, they have these really violent, emotional and exuberant outbursts that happen during the service. And they actually preached in such a way as to provoke these. So, for example, the kind of experience that they advocated, and the preaching terrors that accompanied it, threw congregations into an uproar. And they had this specific tactic. It's called preaching terrors. The idea being that you literally just scare people with hell, with the prospect of hell, that if they don't change, they will have it, or they'll suffer that. And then after this, you hold out to them the grace of Christ. And so after they've come to the point of this sort of extreme emotional pressure, after they come under this, then you hand them or offer to them the release. That's what they have. And so this experience is kind of provoked. And they explicitly did this.
Right.
So this preaching of this experience also prompted the New Side folks who spoke of it to criticize their adversary. So Gilbert Tennant preaches this sermon, The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, in the early 1640s. And he's implying that the old side was bereft of grace. So in other words, it's not just that the two sides had a different in tactics or a difference in emphasis. You actually had New Side people saying, well, I'm not really sure that the old side are actually elect. Right. Not really sure that they're actually saved. And just like we saw with Calvin sending missionaries into France in the earlier centuries, the New Side folks would send their missionaries into places that already had old side preachers. They're stirring the pot here, right? To provoke this experience of grace. So this difference between the two factions, which arose not over theology, but religious experience alone, led to a schism that lasted from 1741 to 1758. And the New Side, which left the Synod of Philadelphia, formed the Synod of New York. So they eventually had this meeting where things sort of went into an uproar, and it got kind of chaotic, this meeting of their Synod, and they end up dividing after that. And so the New Side has their own Synod, and the old side keeps the one that was there before. But the really fascinating thing about this is that the New Side people were trying to provoke the experience of grace. They're trying to provoke something that they identify with the coming of the Holy Spirit. And so the question is it the witness of the Holy Spirit to produce division? That's not supposed to happen.
Right.
Go back to the fruits, right? Love, joy, peace, gentleness.
Unity.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, unity, that they may all be one. Here you have the First Great Awakening, which, depending on which historian you read, they'll say, oh, this was a time of religious fervor and, great religious outbursts and, really good time because the Holy Spirit's really moving. But the folks who look at it that way ignore the fact that there were schisms as a result of this.
Right.
Why is it that the Holy Spirit produces division? I mean, I got to say from a sociological perspective and from a theological perspective, this is really baffling. It's really counterintuitive. Why is this happening?
Right.
Just to give a historical example, St. Augustine experiences grace in the garden. The next thing that happens to him is he converts. He becomes a monk, eventually becomes a bishop. Imagine you experience grace and your experience of grace leads you to divide from the church as opposed to join with it. It's, again, just really fascinating. Why is this here? This is part of the fruit of Protestantism. Okay, so moving on to the Second Great Awakening. This period between 1790 and 1830 saw a range of religious movements, small and large, some with longevity and others not. These included the Mormons, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Shakers, the Christians, later known as the Disciples of Christ, the Millerites, who eventually sort of transformed into the Adventists, and the emergence of the Black Church, among others. All of this happens in this roughly 40-year period. Okay. And the resource for this is Nathan Hatch's book, The Democratization of American Christianity, which, despite its long title, is an absolutely excellent book. Okay. If you are into church history, I strongly recommend Hatch's book. It is great. It is not a book about schism. It's a book about religious populism, essentially. But it's a wonderful read. Just absolutely good. I can't recommend it enough.
I'm going to get it.
So what's that?
I said, I'm going to get it. I don't have that book. I've never read it.
It is an awesome book. So good. I mean, if you're into history, it is a page turner. It's just so good.
I'm always looking for a historical page turner.
Yeah. Really, really good. Really good. So between and all the quotes that I have here are from Hatch's book. Okay. So between 1800 and 1830, a wildly diverse religious culture made both denominational identity and authority fragile creations. Julian Sturdivant, a Yale graduate and congregational missionary to Illinois in 1829, wrote, "In Illinois, I met for the first time a divided Christian community and was plunged without warning or preparation into a sea of sectarian rivalries, which was kept in constant agitation by both legitimate differences of opinion and by ill-judged discussions and unfortunate personalities among ambitious men." And the highlighting a sea of sectarian rivalries, that's my highlighting. That's not in the original text. But I just think it's a really adequate description of religion along the American frontier. And the idea that if you believe in the Bible as your primary, your essential, if not your sole source of authority, you're going to end up with something like this. This is the testament of American history. And I'm going to say a little bit more about it. But again, anybody can take up the Bible, try to understand it for themselves, try to make sense of it, and then try to form churches around it or have arguments around it. Right. So whatever is happening on Discord in the last few decades or, the last decade or so was happening 200 years ago. It was happening 200 years ago in the frontier. This is not a new thing. So sectarianism was there, not say among Presbyterians, but among people who had nothing to do with Presbyterianism or may have scoffed at it because it was uppity. The Presbyterians and the the Presbyterians and the Anglicans, they were the more upper class folks, right? They were the establishment. But lo and behold, the establishment does not have control because populism is rampant, right? So Caleb Rich, this is another example here. Caleb Rich was a Calvinist turned universalist who was bewildered by the competing claims of churches, Hatch writes. And he ends up thinking that he was like St. Paul. He's actually quoted as saying this, or he wrote this, excuse me. He wrote that, quote, "The gospel that was preached by me was not after man, for I neither received of man, nor was I taught it by man, but by revelation of Jesus Christ through the medium of the Holy Spirit." Right? So if you're surrounded by a bunch of denominations and you don't know which one is right, and every other person that you see, it seems, has got some religious idea that they're convinced of, you kind of are left on your own resources. And so you have to figure it out for yourself. And if you're Caleb Rich, who comes to the conclusion of universalism because Calvinist predestination, it seems, was too much for him in his youth, he channels the spirit of Galatians and decides that he's going to put himself on a rough footing with St. Paul. Now, remember, this is the same time that Joseph Smith was supposedly having his revelations. Right? Angels are talking to Joseph Smith. I mean, you can go your own way. You can form a new denomination. God might even be speaking to you. Okay? So a response to this. John Nevin, a traditionalist and representative of Mercersburg theology with Philip Schaff, and Ortlund is a big fan of Philip Schaff. He quotes him some in his book. So Nevin was infuriated by this state of affairs. He attacked the no creed but the Bible mantra of the sects of his day. He was, quote, particularly aware of the gap between a rhetoric that promised to calm sectarian strife and the actual practice of following the Bible, which seemed to multiply denominations endlessly. So the more that you rely on the Bible, the more that you have a glut, of interpretations, right? Then the way that I tend to think about this myself, the sort of thumbnail sketch, is that you have, it's an Aristotelian sort of model. You have interpretation by one, which is more or less Catholicism with the papacy. You have interpretation by the few, that would be orthodoxy, or you have interpretation by the many, that would be Protestantism, right? And so Protestantism says sola scriptura, but here you have, what that essentially means is that you have no effective limit on the number of interpreters, right? Those who represent the mainstream will say, of course, there's a limit, we have these limits, but in practice, denominations keep multiplying, right?
Which calls into ecclesiastical authority. And part of this division is constantly creating a new form of authority based on these diverse interpretations.
Yes, yes. And, where are you going to find authority? Go back to Caleb Ridge again. Where is his authority? He quotes St. Paul,
Right.
and, it's Christ talking to him. And that's where
Right.
universalism came from. Right.
Right.
So there's a long quote from Nevin that I have here. What are we to think of it when we find such a motley mass of protesting systems, all laying claim so vigorously here to one and the same watchword? If the Bible be at once so clear and full as a formulary of Christian doctrine and practice, how does it come to pass where men are left most free to use it in this way and have the greatest mind to do so, according to their own profession, they are flung asunder so perpetually in their religious faith instead of being brought together by its influence? I could not have written this better myself. Just absolutely. I mean, I want to thank Nevin for pointing out the problem so wonderfully. Right now, just to kind of sum up here, the early American Republic was marked by denominations and sects in competition with one another and with more established forms of Protestantism. Again, this was not a realm of the fruits of the Spirit. I would make that argument that love, joy, and gentleness were simply not there in a noticeable way. So what one remembers, and I'm not saying that there weren't peaceful denominations or peaceful churches and congregations here and there. I'm sure there were. But the overall societal ethos was one of competition and confusion. You can think there was a kind of religious market going on here, right? Where there's competition and people were vying for customers, so to speak. Not to be too crass with the analogy, but
they were.
There are actually Protestants who make that analogy, by the way. Roger Finke and Finke and Stark are the two academics, but they actually wrote a book where they argue that American religion is a market, and the stronger the market is, the better it is for American religion. So right. Competition is actually a good thing. Those are guys who were at Baylor. I'm not sure if they're still there now.
Right. So Wade Clark Roof's book on the spiritual marketplace, talking about this unique phenomenon in America from a sociological perspective.
Yeah. Okay. So rather than believers following the way of unity, each one did what was right in his own eyes. That's a quote from Judges 17. This is the witness of Protestantism in America, I would argue, as much today as it was 200 years ago. So I'm not really going into the 20th century. I'm not going to say, I'm not going to mention too much about the various Pentecostal denominations or about non-denominationalism. All of those things have happened there before our eyes. Right? This is the history that is handed to us. Right. And I'm not saying that Protestantism is 100% division, or it's 100% people who are trying to kill each other, or 100% people who are splitting churches. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that division is pervasive.
Right.
That it is a recurrent, periodically, it may be periodic, but it is periodically inescapable fruit of Protestantism.
Yeah.
And I think as well, there are a lot of Protestants who are just good people, and they go to church. They go to churches with other people who are good people, by which I mean they're friendly and they're responsible and they're sort of tax-paying citizens. I mean, they're not bad folks or anything like that. And so the churches are made up of these, easy to be with folks, but they don't see the history of breakdown. They don't see the history of division, this history of fracture, as a meaningful fruit, I think, because their experience in their church is comfortable.
Right.
And so I'm going to let Ortlund respond a little bit here through Schaff and Nevin. I think he's basically, simpatico with those guys. So Schaff and Nevin argued that sectarian errors were not intrinsic to Protestantism. Schaff says the sect system, like rationalism, is a prostitution and a caricature of true Protestantism. So that's the argument that they make. This is, I think, a sort of standard, establishment way of looking at sectarianism within Protestantism. This isn't real Protestantism. This isn't the magisterial Reformation, right? This is something else, right? But if sectarianism is not intrinsic to Protestantism, why is it so pervasive? I mean, Ortlund recognizes it as a disease. I mean, he's not going to sit here and cheerlead for sectarianism. But if there's no cure, and if the disease doesn't lessen over centuries, surely the nature of the organism is at fault.
Right.
At the very best, Protestantism lacks the institutional restraints to control the monster it has birthed.
Right.
Right? If you've got a virus and you can't cure the virus, there's a significant problem there.
Right.
Right? There's a significant problem. So that is that I think is all I have for the first thesis. Yes. So that's it for thesis 1. All right. So division is pervasive in Protestantism, whether it's war or whether it's schism. There's a whole history of centuries involved here.
And so I got a couple of questions before we move on to the next theses.
Sure.
And I'm curious then, when I went over your PowerPoint before the stream, one of the thoughts that I had is I was curious what especially given your military background, how do you connect the modern American military industrial complex and the continual warfare with our Protestant legacy? Do you think there's a connection there?
Well, okay. The first thing that comes to my mind is the idea of capitalism as an expanding thing that's always looking for new markets, and that war is a way of expanding markets. There's a certain kinship with the Protestant missionary impulse, right? Like if you're going to look for new fields or new harvest fields, rather, even if there's churches there already, right? So we're going to send our missionaries to go out and spread this gospel and spread this religion. That missionary impulse, and I don't want to draw this line too closely, but there's an impulse for expansion within the military industrial complex for the sake of capitalism, right? Historically, right? So you're going to go into new places, and people would make this argument about the war I fought in, right? Like, why did we go to Iraq? Well, there's oil there, right? We got oil money to be made. So this opens up a certain resource for people to make more money, But again, I think historically, I wouldn't make that argument too strongly. It just strikes me as a sort of superficial kinship when you ask the question.
Well, I mean, when you say that, bringing up capitalism, I immediately think of Max Weber and capitalism and the Protestant work ethic, and that capitalism in the market is a way in which one acts out their salvation.
Yeah, definitely. Weber's obviously really, he's really brilliant. But I can see that. Yeah, certainly. I mean, if you're looking for evidences of your salvation, right, which is this sort of reformed teaching of what good works are, and those evidences are in your calling, right? So they're principally how well you do your job. Then looking for new markets is evidence of your salvation, right? So yeah, there's a connection you can make there.
Yeah, and that connected. I was writing down notes while you were speaking. Is when you're talking about the marketing of these various divisions and these sectarian movements. One of the defining features of the American ethos is consumerism. And I couldn't help, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, but I couldn't help but think that it's the church shopping in a way, even at the very early onset of the American experiment, that especially dealing with the ultimate claims. We're talking about God, we're talking about religion, we're talking about your paradigm, your moral framework, that this idea that you can move and shop, which is obviously ahistorical before the Protestant Reformation, really set the stage for this sort of underlying mentality of consumerism in America.
Well, I sort of wonder to myself when that transformation happened, because my sense from looking, from studying history, is that the more prevalent attitude, say in the early American Republic, is not so much about shopping and going where best fits you, like finding the place that's right for you. It's more genuinely about finding true salvation, right? Caleb Rich leaves the Calvinist church because it is causing him a great deal of anxiety. He wants to be saved, and so people are moving around because they genuinely want salvation. I think by the time you get into the 20th century, there's that kind of fusion that you're talking about. I don't know if I don't know when that transformation would have happened, though, because when you get into the 18th century, at the end of the Second Great Awakening, you've already got non-Christian movements that are proliferating. So Emerson was writing, Thoreau was writing. is you have people looking outside the church. I mean, you have the transcendentalist movement, right? And you have various others. So the idea of choosing a salvation that is tailored to you, you know, like we're a long way away from the 1980s, but there's certain seeds of it that are happening there, and they're not necessarily happening within Christendom. Like they may be, you know, but that's not really the story that Hatch tells. I think there's other sources, and I wish I could remember the book. The author is Lee Schmidt, but it's all about the growth of sort of for lack of a better word, like spiritual but not religious movements in the mid 19th century. You know, so I think there's some sort of shift that happens there from the early American Republic, sometime probably in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. You know, where that consumerist attitude becomes more prevalent, because obviously it's what we've got today, right? But I would just wonder, how far back does it go?
Yeah, that's why I was curious on what your thoughts were.
Yeah.
And why don't we then go ahead, and I'm already on the next slide regarding the meaning of Protestantism.
Okay, sure.
We'll dive into your thesis number 2.
All right, thesis number 2.
And let me just say before you start, anybody, if you have questions, we're going to take questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, you can send those in. Once he's done laying out his arguments, we'll then take questions if any of you guys have any.
Okay. So before we get started on this, I am going to present an argument here for the meaning of Protestantism, more specifically for the meaning of justification by faith alone, that, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a little bit more abstract. And so it's a little bit more theological. It's not a historical survey, although it does involve some history. And it's a different argument. I'm not aware that anybody else makes this argument. So if you're one of those folks out there who's really familiar with all the back and forth that happens online, you can add this to your bag of, of arguments that you're familiar with, I guess. So anyway, starting again with Ortlund. Ortlund says, Protestantism is the principle of movement, of progress in the history of the church. He says that the whole idea of Protestantism is continual reform. This is the glory and strength of the Protestant doctrine referenced in the subtitle of his book, Semper Reformanda, and the subtitle of his book is The Case for an Always Reforming Church. So Protestantism, he writes, takes its peculiar shape and character in order to serve the renewal and betterment of the church. So I am going to argue in my second thesis that the meaning of the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone, a product of medieval Catholicism, is the division or liberation of man from his nature as God's creature and the elimination of his rest in God. I should have subtitled this, Protestantism is an always revolutionizing religion, or an always revolutionizing church, as opposed to an always reforming church, because we'll see hopefully how that plays in. Now, I have in brackets in this slide that Luther's doctrine of justification should be understood in the context of medieval legal development, not of indulgences and Catholic persecution of dissent. And Ortlund sees Luther as coming out of these, out of the problem with indulgences and Catholic persecution. Those things were there. I'm not denying them. And I think there's definitely a strand of scholarship out there that sees the Reformation through that lens. But when I was looking for the origin of Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone, when I was trying to search for what is behind freedom of a Christian, it's not indulgences. There's something else going on. I frankly think that if you take away the medieval legal development, you don't have Luther, but we'll get into that. I'll make the case here.
Right. But this is a novel argument because, as you said, Ortlund, and I would say the general argument is that it's a response against indulgences.
Yeah, like Catholic corruption is kind of the main response. Catholic corruption. Indulgences is emblematic of that, right?
Right.
I mean, it's the big one. And I get that. I mean, it is a corruption.
And there's no doubt that it may have influenced, but when we were talking on the phone before, this was a few weeks ago, I thought that was a really interesting argument because you were highlighting regarding intellectual history, the importance of the scholastic period and this legal emphasis in some of the canon law and how this has influenced the trajectory of Western civilization, something that I probably underappreciate in some of my discussions on intellectual history.
Well, Berman, the legal scholar, he makes the argument that canon law is the precursor for modern state law. I make the argument in Analogia Journal that Luther's experience of the canon law is a spiritual precursor. Well, okay, not precursor, but it is a spiritual version of totalitarian law.
Mm.
So like if you're looking for an experience of totalitarianism, the basic elements of it are there in Luther's experience of canon law.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the church law that then becomes the state law. And Berman is really the best resource for that.
Yeah.
But okay, so let's get into the argument. And I need to give some background here. Okay. First, God creates his creatures with a particular law for their being. All right. And what I mean by law is definition or nature. Okay. So an alligator has a law that makes it an alligator and not an eagle. Okay. A tree has a law that makes it a tree and not a human being. You can look at it and see it has something that defines it. Okay.
Right.
So it has, and this is just kind of, you know, patristic era natural law theory, if
Right.
you will. I'm not saying anything that's, you know, stepping out of the fathers or anything like that. Right. So the law for man includes both his definition as a man, that i.e. his physical bodily shape, and his spiritual orientation towards God. Okay, so this law is written into us as what we are supposed to be. Another way of saying this in Orthodox terms is that you're destined for theosis, right? The law is there. You're living out what it is to be human, you know, becoming truly human, we say, right? So this orientation receives explicit statements in the law of Moses and the commands of Christ. All right. So there is this law that's within us. This law has to do with Moses and Christ. I would argue that the law fundamentally has to do with work and rest. You know, and I'm a little bit different, I think, than a lot of folks out there, that I see work and rest as just these basic biblical categories. I mean, the idea that rest is holy is pretty indisputable, you know, because it says it very clearly. But the balance of work and rest, I think, has really been obscured in the West for a long time. And I don't think the fathers would disagree I certainly don't think the fathers would disagree with it. But I think that they don't use those terms directly, you know. But the bearing of burdens is tremendously important. You know, what burdens do you bear? How do you have rest from those burdens? I think this is just really central for understanding the biblical message about love and about human relationships. So let's talk for just a second about the Exodus. And once you see things this way, then the comparison in Exodus between the Pharaoh and God is between a law that does not allow rest versus a law that does allow rest. Okay. So many people miss this, David. When Moses and Aaron go to the Pharaoh in the Exodus story, they never ask for the slaves to be freed. They never ask for that. Now they're going to free the slaves, right? That's going to happen. Okay. We know that's God's purpose, but they always say, let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness to make sacrifice. What is it that they are asking for? They're not asking for freedom. They're asking for rest, right? They're asking for what is holy. And when what is holy is denied them, when what is holy is denied them, that's when God kicks into action and liberates them. And by the way, Pharaoh gets this. If you go to Exodus 5, Moses and Aaron have made their plea. They've made their request. And what's Pharaoh's response? You are lazy, lazy. Get back to your labors. Right? Like the contrast is between work without rest and the request for rest.
Right.
Okay? Because sacrifice spiritually is our rest in God, right? That's where our labors cease and God does the salvific work. Okay. So when they ask to go and make a 3 days journey into sacrifice, they're asking for physical rest and spiritual rest. And Pharaoh says, nope, you will not have it. So that's on one end. Then on the opposite end, after they are liberated, they go to Sinai. God gives them a law, and that law has a well-established and elaborate sacrificial cult. Right? So you've got law without sacrifice or rest and law with sacrifice and rest. And the first commandment out of the 10 commandments, I mean, I'm sure you know this. I'm sure everybody in the audience knows this. But the first commandment that deals with human relationships is resting on the Sabbath. And who rests? Everybody, right? You, your children, your wife, your male and female servant, everybody rests, right? So, okay. So the question that I am now going to ask, given that dichotomy, is how did God become the Pharaoh? This is the question.
Right.
Historically, the argument that I'm going to make is that the divine law becomes the law of the Pharaoh. Okay, it becomes a law that deprives man of rest rather than securing it for him. All
Right.
right, so that dichotomy between God and the Pharaoh in Exodus becomes a fusion, and this happens, I argue, over the latter centuries of the medieval era. So, how does this happen? Step one: the law is systematized. The Catholic canon law is systematized, particularly over the 12th and 13th century. Now, this begins with what's called the investiture crisis, which is a battle between the Pope on the one hand and local rulers on the other about who gets to decide who the bishop is, the local bishop. So the local bishop was a very powerful position. Up until this time, the local ruler got to pick who the bishop was, but this was corrupting the church in various ways. And so the Pope, Gregory VII, says, no way, I'm the one who gets to choose bishops now. And guess what happens as a result of that? War breaks out.
Right.
Right. So at the same time that there are wars that are breaking out over this issue, however, you have legal teams. For the first time in history, legal experts are required to make arguments drawing from the scripture, from the fathers, from Roman law, from all these varieties of laws. You have arguments that now have to be made about who has jurisdiction, who's actually right to choose who the local bishop is.
Right.
And this spawns, in its embryonic form, this spawns modern law. It spawns the Western legal tradition. Okay, so Gratian, who lived in the 12th century, writes his Decretum in 1140, which is the most famous of these collections of laws. So Decretum was a collection and harmonization of various legal sources, right? And a whole school of people followed him. They were known as the Decretists, okay? And so what they did was compound laws upon laws, and where two laws, two stipulations were divergent from one another, they tried to smooth it out and figure out who's right. Where can we make the law more coherent, right? And over this process of laws upon laws being collected and analyzed and restated and collated and whatever else however else you might want to term it, the law is growing. It becomes something organically developing. That's Berman terms. The law organically develops. It becomes larger. It becomes universal and comprehensive at the same time that it becomes exact. Okay. And so the legal apparatus of the modern West becomes something unique. Needless to say, nothing like this happens in the East. Okay. If people want to ask, why did we never have a Luther in the Eastern Orthodox Church? My response is that we never had the legal development that preceded him. Okay.
Interesting. I think most people would say, well, we didn't have the Renaissance. We didn't have the Reformation. We didn't have the scientific revolution. That's very interesting to point towards canon law, which actually is a precursor to the Renaissance itself.
Yes, this is a precursor to nominalism. This is a precursor to the Renaissance. This is a precursor to all of that, right? Is what I would refer to, my term for it is the infinitization of the law, right? The law becomes this vast, incomprehensible thing in terms of its stipulations and how these stipulations are being managed and just the compounding and compiling of various kinds of laws. So it becomes something that was unknown heretofore. And universities spring up as a result of this development. They are part of this. So the modern university starts in the 12th century because legal experts were needed. Although it's not solely that. I need to say, there's certain, Bologna was the place for legal experts. You had humanism that was developing at the same time. And the humanists, by the way, this is a little bit of an aside, but they were very critical of the lawyers. They didn't like this sort of the emphasis on law. So, they're more artistic. They like poetry, So, so anyway, and I've got a couple of sources here. Brian Tierney's Crisis of Church and State outlines this really well. And Berman's text, Law and Revolution, the Formation of the Western Legal Tradition, the first volume, he wrote 2 volumes. They're both massive. And the first one is really the one that we're emphasizing here. So
I haven't read that book either. I feel like I need to get that one.
Well, yeah, it's good. It's good. And the Tierney book is actually a collection of original sources. Oh. So it's not just like a secondary text, He actually has snippets from this or that text from the 1100s or whatever, and so it's a really good resource. So, all right. So what happens in step 2 after step 1? Well, we have to understand that the law and the systematization of the law has everything to do with scholasticism, right? They go hand in hand. And the dialectical method in scholasticism as well. This law is not only political, it's not only ecclesiastical, it's not only about, who gets to pick the bishop. That's the core issue where things start, is this notion of jurisdiction between secular authorities and church authorities. But this sort of systematization, it just infects everything about the law. So it's not only political or ecclesiastical, but also moral and spiritual, i.e., having to do with salvation. So imagine the systematization of the law influencing how you live your spiritual life. And it's applied to the religious conscience, particularly to the monks. Okay. So when you become a monk in late medieval Catholicism, going to confession and the state of your spiritual life becomes something that causes a great degree of anxiety. And my source here is James McHugh. He's a historian. He wrote this great little article, Simul Justus et Peccator in Augustine, Aquinas, and Luther. And, sort of as an aside, he makes the observation that the problem of the anxious conscience, doesn't really show up until the early 1300s, which on the political level, that's the same time that the papacy was removed from Rome and spent the next 70 years or so in Avignon. Right. Mm-hmm. So you just got a collapse all around of Catholicism. But at this point, the problem becomes what happens when you go to confession. You have to confess all of your sins. And that's not really possible to do. I mean, for the Orthodox folks who are watching this, imagine you went to confession and you had to confess every single thing that you have done. And now all of a sudden you have to draw these strict lines in your mind between, okay, am I just being tempted or have I actually sinned here?
Right.
And you have to remember, like, every time that you should have done a good thing that you didn't do. Right. Or every time that you did whatever thing, you have to list all of your sins. And so it's 200 years before we get to step 3, which is the arrival of Luther. And Luther is the culmination of this development. Okay. It has been going on for a while. You have legal development, you have the anxious conscience developing, and then you've got Luther in the early 1500s. So Luther arrives again roughly 200 years later and is the product again of this development. By this time, the law had become a tyrant and an oppressor, and it was truly the law of the Pharaoh. If you know anything about Luther, you know that he struggled mightily with the idea of the wrath and the righteousness of God.
Right.
You know that this was like a triggering phrase for him, to use a modern term, right? He was terrified. Well, where did that God come from? Where does the fear come from? I mean, I would hypothesize that the nominalist idea of this terrifying God is an outgrowth of the infinite law. Like, you have a law that becomes infinite, that is representative of the will of God.
Right.
And this exacting and comprehensive law, this totalitarian law, becomes a kind of precursor to a totalitarian experience of God. Right? If the law was merciful, how could God be a tyrant? But if the law ceases to be merciful, then God himself, in the mercy of God, falls away. And now what stands in the foreground is holiness and righteousness and the things that terrify you, right?
Right.
So with all of this in mind, I'm going to read a long quote from Luther. This is from his 1531 Galatians commentary, but it gives a really good example of Luther's own religious experience, in my opinion. I think he's talking about himself here. Mm-hmm. Okay. And probably other people that he knows. So let's pretend for a moment, let's walk with Luther through his religious development and see how this goes. Okay. Therefore, anyone who seeks righteousness through the law does nothing by his repeated actions, but acquire the habit of this first action, which is that God in his wrath and awe is to be appeased by works. On the basis of this opinion, he begins to do works. Yet he can never find enough works to make his conscience peaceful. But he keeps looking for more, and even in the ones he does perform, he finds sin. Therefore, his conscience can never become sure, but he must continually doubt and think this way. You have not sacrificed correctly. You have not prayed correctly. You have omitted something. You have committed this or that sin. Then the heart trembles and can itself loaded down with wagon loads of sins that increase infinitely. so that it deviates further and further from righteousness until it finally acquires the habit of despair. Many who have been driven to such despair cried out miserably in the agony of death, "Miserable man that I am, I have not observed the rules of my monastic order. Where shall I flee from the countenance of Christ, the wrathful judge?" Thus, at the end of his life, a monk is weaker, more beggarly, more unbelieving, and more fearful than he was at the beginning. The law or human traditions or the rule of his monastic order were supposed to heal and enrich him in his illness and poverty, but he became weaker and more beggarly than the tax collectors and harlots. In the end, he is forced to despair. Therefore, it is impossible for men who want to provide for their salvation through the law, as all men are inclined to do by nature, ever to be set at peace. In fact, they only pile laws upon laws by which they torture themselves and others and make their consciences so miserable that many of them die before their time because of excessive anguish of heart. For one law always produces 10 more until they grow to infinity. This is shown by the innumerable summi that collect and expound such laws. Now, this is a direct quote of Luther referencing the legal history that I have explained just a few slides ago, right? Just a few minutes ago. What has it done to him? He joins his monastic order. Luther is a very studious and, exacting monk. He wants to be the best monk he can be, right? He wants to be saved. And so he follows the rule of his monastic order. But the more that he finds that he's supposed to do, the more that he finds is undone. And the things that are not done overshadow and outweigh the things that have been done. So that the little that he has done does not cause the grace of God to draw near to him. Rather, it is so overshadowed by what he hasn't done that he's continually confronted with the wrath and awe and holiness of God as something that is just waiting to condemn him. Right? And so if you imagine these vast collections of laws that were being compiled in, say, the 12th century and now have a history for a few hundred years leading up to Luther, imagine all of those laws being put on your desk and somebody tells you, obey this.
Right.
And if you don't obey in the slightest of details, you're damned. Right. And so Luther is just distraught, right? He doesn't know what to do. God has become the Pharaoh. Right? The law of God no longer gives rest. So what is Luther's solution? And here I just have a little summary here. Luther experiences God qua lawgiver as the Pharaoh, right? So what is Luther's solution in the next slide? The idea when he has his tower experience is that justification comes by faith alone and Christ is the liberator. Christ is the one who takes on the burden of the law. He becomes the new Moses. So if God as lawgiver, Luther really never says God the Father that I'm aware of. So I'm just saying God as lawgiver. If that's the Pharaoh, then Christ is the new Moses, right? He is the liberator from the curse of the law, where the old law binds, accuses, and curses. The law of Christ binds the law that binds, accuses the law that accuses, and curses the law that curses. And he actually uses that kind of language in the Galatians commentary. This new law of Christ is the law of liberty, which Luther understands as peace of conscience vis-a-vis the law, which can no longer terrify. And so what happens here, David, is that the template of the Exodus has become the template of salvation.
Right.
Okay. So we see something going on. Now, how do we understand God? And this is the next slide here. If God qua lawgiver is the Pharaoh, God qua lawgiver is the Pharaoh, God qua liberator is Jesus Christ. What this means is two things I want to point out. Number one is that God is now bifurcated. There's two parts of God that are at odds with each other.
Right.
Okay. They're antagonists. All right. The second thing that's really fascinating is that the perversion of the law, so that it is no longer merciful and rest-giving, has now made intrinsic to salvation. Like you have to experience the perverted law in order to be saved. If you're going to experience grace, you have to come under this law that makes you feel like you're damned. And I want to jump back for a minute to the First Great Awakening and preaching terrors, right? The idea of preaching terrors comes straight out of the Reformation playbook. Like you've got to come under this law that makes you feel like you're damned and cry out in agony and groan for the grace of God so that you can then give up all trust in nature, all trust in works, and turn fully to Christ. Luther writes, experience him for you and me, like appropriate Christ emotionally, right? You've got to have the law before you can have that experience of grace. Again, why is there no Reformation in the West? Or I'm sorry, in the East? Why has there been no Orthodox Reformation? Well, there's no totalitarian law that's developed over centuries, and there's no need to escape from that law and redefinition of salvation as escape from that law.
Right.
Right?
Fantastic point.
So, okay. Now, the next point is absolutely crucial. Okay. The law is not only understood as divine law or Catholic canon law. Now, I've been talking about it in those terms up to this point, but this law is also natural law. Okay, Luther doesn't significantly distinguish divine law from natural law. Okay. Now, if divine law is natural law, if divine law is a restatement of natural law, and if natural law is something that is intrinsic to human nature, in other words, if there's some part of us that instantiates that law, that it is within us, then the pattern of bifurcation that happened in God is now replicated in the human person.
Right.
Okay. So the perversion of the law is now part of us. Like our nature is something that denies us rest. On the other hand, we're destined for grace, right? God made us to experience grace and to seek him. So liberation from that law is also part of us. Right. And you can just sort of see the Gnosticism dripping off of this, right?
Yep.
So, so anyway, if there is a totalitarian or pharaonic law that is now human nature, and on the other hand, you're destined for escape from that, then grace means liberation from nature. It also means liberation from nature as God, or nature as created by God, which means ultimately you're being liberated from God.
Right.
Right. And so you've got a template for the meaning of justification by faith alone. I don't want to say like Protestantism as a whole, but the form of salvation that's really at the core here. Right. You know, one of the Luther scholars says that his doctrine of justification is his theology. Like it just basically boils down to that. You know? So anyway, you've got a bifurcation in God. And just to put it another way, if man is made in the image of God, then that image somehow adopts that bifurcation.
Right.
And our form of salvation is to live out that bifurcation. Right. You know, I put as a question mark at the bottom of the next slide, you know, what's the relation of this to modern liberation from nature and from God, right? So if this is what we are, well, you know, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the Reformation doctrine of justification by faith alone, like caused this historically or caused that historically. I don't necessarily think it's an efficient cause, but I do think there's a good question about whether or not it's a final cause for certain developments. And, you know, by final cause, what that means is that all things have sort of a telos or goal, and that there's telos or goal that has a certain kind of causality. Right. It's a certain direction in which things are moving. And I think Aristotelian categories are just really helpful here.
Yeah.
You know? And so I would think of it like that. Right. And, you know, Protestant notions of progress and secular notions of progress as well, very often they just amount to liberation from nature. Right. If you think about technological progress, scientific progress, there's a lot of liberation from natural experience that's involved there. Right. And I don't want to go into that. This isn't a lecture about the modern world per se. It's just about the nature of salvation and the meaning of Protestantism. And I think the meaning of Protestantism is that it gives a fundamentally different form of salvation than what the ancient world knew.
Right.
And
it affects ontology itself and how we understand ourselves as beings.
Precisely. Yes. To put it in biblical terms, I'm glad you said that. To put it in biblical terms, the ontology of salvation is gathering, but this is an ontology of scattering.
Right.
Okay. Like that's, I really like those terms. I use them a lot in the book, actually. So I'm glad you brought that up. Okay. So a couple of objections, and these are things that I say, you know, I think a good studious Lutheran would probably respond to me with this. Luther says that after the experience of grace, the believer obeys out of gratitude for Christ's saving work. Can't this happen? I mean, if the law has been just negated somehow, if you're freed from it, well, what about the idea that you're supposed to go back to law and be obedient? I mean, Lutherans in practice will do this, don't they? Second objection, Luther says that grace only destroys the law's capacity to terrify, not the law per se. But I am implying that grace liberates from the law itself, as Moses released the Israelites from Egypt.
Right.
Okay?
Using that same Exodus motif.
Yeah. So how would I answer these? One sort of combined answer to both objections. It is that the form of the law has changed over the course of medieval history. This cannot be overstated.
Right.
And Luther cannot just sort of wave his hand and make that form go away. Okay? When St. Augustine says, the law that I once feared, now I love, he's talking about human nature that was sick now being healed, and so he loves the law. The law is never really at fault for somebody like St. Augustine. For Luther, by contrast, the form of the law has been perverted in a way that is contrary to the gospel. Luther makes that intrinsic to his understanding of salvation. And what is more, he can't just change the form of the law. He can't just say, well, now the law is merciful. No, it's not. You've adopted it into your form of salvation. And practically, historically, this is a fact that no one has tried to unwind or undo, right?
Right.
So if that's the case, then the law is now intrinsically terrifying. This terror may not always be immediately evident, right? So think about Luther's example where he starts on his monastic order and he's not terrified at first, right? It's after doing it for several years that the burden becomes unlivable for him, right? But the argument that I would make is that the law must reveal itself as terror at some point. And there are actually Lutheran scholars who talk about the Lutheran dialectic and being caught between grace and law and sort of swinging between the two, as it were, So there's actually some kind of version of this in Luther scholarship. Likewise, if the law is intrinsically terrifying such that terror is constitutive of its form, to annul the form is to annul the content, right? So you can't annul the terror of a law that is intrinsically terrifying without annulling the law itself.
Right.
That's the argument. Okay. So that's my response to the two objections. And again, they're both like a little more abstract, a little more philosophical, I guess. Right. But so last slide is just a summary, two theses, but that is pretty much it for the arguments that I wanted to make.
So one of the takeaways here is, looking at some of these Reformed apologists, such as Ortlund and others, do you think they would even concede, especially this ontological point? Because this is foundational, especially from an Orthodox perspective. Because your objections were more about how regards to the law itself. But there is as we highlighted, a massive ontological distinction here between how we understand not just the body of Christ, but what the point of us as beings imitating Christ would be. How do you think they would respond to that?
I've really sort of racked my brain about where, say, a Luther scholar would try to pick this argument apart, right? I think that if they don't accept the idea of natural law being written into us in some way, right? So let's say for a minute, let's imagine that you're a Lutheran who is a nominalist.
Okay.
Well, it's hard to be a nominalist. You say, well, I'm a nominalist. There's not really such a thing as human nature that's intrinsic to it. You're just opening yourself up to all kinds of social objections, right? From Christians, what I mean? So I don't know if they're going to go there, right? But I think that I think that they would be really hesitant. I'm not exactly sure, and I haven't come up myself with how they would formulate the idea that that this is a new ontology for man. How they would object to that. The way that I look at it, to be honest with you, David, is that God gave man a nature, and in terms of mobility, that nature is, say, walking or running or riding a horse or a carriage or something like that. But in the modern world, there's a new nature, basically automobiles, that's overlaid onto the old nature. So that the way that an asphalt road is paved onto the ground, right? And so there's this new ontology that has been overlaid onto the natural one, And this, in my opinion, this is the theological root of that. But yeah, I think that in order to be politically safe, they have to say, among Christians anyway, to be politically safe among Christians, they have to say, well, there's some sort of natural law. There's some sort of essence, right? There is something written.
This was the arguments against Jay when he was just on Tucker, because he was bringing up how he believed nominalism was a domino effect leading towards a lot of the problems we're seeing in modern Protestant Christianity. And then they immediately respond by, oh, you know, we're not nominalists. We believe in essentialism and all this different stuff.
Yeah.
But even among them, talking about the division, how far and how strict they are in regards to their social ethics varies quite differently.
Yeah, it really does. It depends on who you're talking to.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really does. It depends on who you're talking to. But just to repeat myself, I guess I really have tried to think hard about where you would poke holes in this argument. Like where they're gonna say, like, no, this isn't a new human nature, because the historical piece in terms of the development of the law, I think is pretty indisputable.
Yes.
And the idea that Luther makes this law intrinsic to his experience of salvation, I think is also indisputable. You know, right. I just don't see a counter argument to that, especially given his own words. But I think a lot of Protestants are going to balk at the idea that, like, whoa, this is human nature now? Like, this is what we've been doing for the last 500 years? Yeah. I don't think people are going to like that conclusion. And right. So, you know, naturally they're going to try to find some way to disprove it, but I'm not 100% sure where they would go.
Yeah, that's what I was that's what the question was leading to. I'm curious, because that, you know, I came at this sort of historical trajectory. I see it exactly the same way. I love the argument you're presenting regarding canon law and how this is the liberation from the law. But this liberation, I mean, as we talked about privately, this correlates perfectly with my understanding of transhumanism. And why is this uniquely a Western civilizational thing? Why is the idea that technology will redeem us back to the state of Adam before the fall and bring us into a utopia? Why is this coming out of Western civilization? And given everything that you just presented and seeing it more comprehensively, it's like, well, this is a trajectory of ontological transformation, you know, let alone we get Darwin eventually bringing a new doctrine of what man is as this evolving creature. But all of it, even transhumanism, is liberating from that law. Let me respond this way. Okay. I haven't talked a whole lot about the different valences and aspects of the notion of the infinite law. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the way that I put it in the book is that this is an infinitizing of the law, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say that each one of us now has an infinite law within us. What does that mean? Well, Luther experiences it as an infinite burden. Okay. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't have to be experienced that way because it is infinite. You don't experience it in just one singular way. Right. So when you are think about it this way. Remember the bifurcation in man, where there's a part that is representative of the law, and then there's a part that's destined to be liberated from that law. Mm-hmm. The liberation is itself a form of infinity. So on the one hand, nature is something that you suffer as a kind of infinite burden. Although I don't think that people historically looked at their nature and said, "Oh, I'm under an infinite burden." It's more like they were sort of optimistically looking towards liberation from it. Mm-hmm. But when you are liberated, you become an infinite possibility creature. And so rather than the infinity being experienced as burden, it's experienced as possibility. And so when I think about transhumanism, or I think about, say, modern automobiles versus, you know, walking to get to your destination, it is an explosion in the meaning of the possibility of what it is that humans can do. Right.
Right. So there's dual sides to what it means to be an infinite possibility creature. Okay. And they're experienced in different ways at different places. Like when I think about, you know, the concept of the infinite in the modern world, I think transhumanism is definitely like a liberation from nature towards some sort of infinite possibility, because the boundaries of space and time, i.e. bodily existence, are no longer there to restrain you. Right. So you become this, but this is the sort of end point. Like this is the salvation point when you have been liberated from the body as something that is a burden, something that is like the way that I like to think about it is that in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, they didn't necessarily think the body was some totalitarian thing they had to escape. Right. They were optimistic about scientific progress. But now, if you took people like you and me, who are sitting here in air conditioning talking across a computer screen, and you put them back in the 16th century, it would be some level of Dante's Inferno. I'm not sure which one, but like, but we would be like, oh my goodness, you know, what on earth has happened? This is terrible. But that, I mean, that's the way that. So I think that that notion of the body as some sort of totalitarian burden or some sort of just unlivable burden is now something that's implicit in our existence at the end. It wasn't necessarily there at the beginning, which I find kind of ironic. But that notion of the infinite as infinite possibility, not just infinite burden, I think plays into transhumanism.
Yeah,
and plays into, you know, various forms of social and technological liberation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you know, I think that technology too, why it's unique to Protestant nations and their productivity gets back to Weber and this capitalism and the Protestant work ethic.
Yeah.
And you look at America and Silicon Valley, I write about this in my book, that once we hit the Pacific Ocean, you know, the frontier ended. What is the new frontier? The new frontier is technological possibilities. And then you see it set up right there in Silicon Valley. And that sets the new frontier for humanity. And that's where we're existing in right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's a new frontier of liberation, right? Yes. I mean, it's essentially, and I mean, I think that's really interesting. I like that sort of geographical way of thinking about it. You know, that's interesting. It's like we get to the other ocean. Now what do we do? Yeah, I get that. I think there's a lot to be said about, like, the way that I think about this in terms of Luther is his idea of the law of liberty, right? Which he writes about in his work. And I think I'd mentioned it at one point in the slides. The law of liberty is the freedom that Christ gives us, according to Luther. And for Luther himself, this was primarily freedom of conscience, right? You're no longer burdened under the law. But the law of liberty, as we understand it, say in the modern United States, has just got these applications all over the place, right? Not least of which technology.
Right. Yeah. I mean, transgenderism, all political, you know, so many political movements. And that led me to a question I wrote down. I was curious, like, do you see a connection? Because this is one that I've speculated or hypothesized in streams about American political involvement being tied to the Protestant heritage, and how politics act as, especially now, so since high church Protestantism is, you know, not really the dominant strand, but especially among the evangelicals, you can kind of see aspects of it in the MAGA movement that that it's almost a sacrament, that participating in the political system and American politics themselves almost become sacramental. And I was wondering if you see that, and if you do, how it relates to, again, the law.
Okay, so let me first say that I lived in New Haven, Connecticut for 3 years. Politics is a sacrament there.
Okay.
Like, without doubt. I grew up in South Carolina. I was, you know, interested in politics, right? I had no idea that people could be so consumed by politics until I lived up there. Oh my goodness. So yes, there's that. I think when it comes to connections between evangelicalism and politics, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you could go to that, you know? So for example, there's a big strand in evangelicalism that's support, you know, support of Israel, for example.
Yeah. The whole dispensationalist movement.
Yeah, I think also as well, you've got just, to go back to Hatch's book, how populism as a political impulse has this religious expression, right? So, you know, skepticism of elites, freedom of expression, the idea of the audience being the sort of sovereign, you know, barometer, right, of one's truthfulness. That's all there in evangelicalism, because, and the thing is, Protestantism, it sets the stage, it sets the conditions for this by its lack of institutional control. You know, so you just basically got this open air for these things to proliferate, right? And so if democracy is a realm of freedom of expression, you know, Protestantism is a realm of freedom of biblical interpretation. Even though, you know, Nevin and Schaff and those guys are not going to like that, that's just what it is.
Right.
You know, I mean, this is where the argument that sectarianism, and I'm getting away from politics, so forgive me, but this is the argument where the argument for sectarianism as a caricature of Protestantism really falls flat to me, because all you have to do is ride down the street and you see the sectarianism.
Right.
And so for someone to look at you and say, hey, this isn't real Protestantism, I'd be like, look, man, there's a building right there, and there's a building right there, and there's a building right there, and they all say they're Protestant. You know, like this is the fact that I'm living with. But yeah, the various forms of populism and freedom of expression, I think, go hand in hand with each other.
And just like you talked about the law in the East being, you know, interpreted by the few as opposed to interpreted by the one in the papacy and then interpreted by the many in Protestantism. I've heard so many times Protestants say, oh, well, you talk about sectarianism or division. Well, you guys have the Russian church and the Greek church and the Serbian church. And again, to me, it reminded me of that metaphor that you use, because we have one theology. There's one body of Christ that unifies it. And yes, there are, to me, it appeals back to solving the one and the many, the philosophical. We have, yes, different varieties, but it's the same body of Christ. It's the same theology. It's unified in multiplicity. Yes. Whereas they don't have unity in their multiplicity, and Catholicism is just all about unity under a singular head.
Yes, everybody's in communion with each other, which makes it one body, which is different, vastly different from the wars of religion in which people were slaughtering each other. Or when people break away, you know, in the First Great Awakening, they break away because of the experience of grace. You know, this, again, like, I'm sorry, I cannot put an end to my bafflement at this actually happening historically. But yes, the Orthodox are together in communion with each other, and the jurisdictions being in this country or that country having national churches, I mean, it's just simplicity of organization. Right. You know, people have to have boundaries. It's not like they're just angry with each other or something, you know?
Right. So I think we have, if you guys have questions, send them in. I got one more. Mine is, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the future. I know this is a speculative, I just want your speculation if you feel comfortable sharing it, but you know, we're seeing a lot of angst amongst the Protestant apologists right now. And obviously we're seeing a massive influx of Protestants into the Orthodox Church. And this is causing these response videos and these criticisms and saying how, or, you know, you can't be, basically orthodoxy is anti-American in some way. And I've made the point, looking at Pew demographic research, that you look at the average age of attendee in America and you break down all religions, not just Christianity, all religions. Protestantism has the oldest, and then all the varieties have the oldest average age of attendee. I think the youngest was like in the 50s, mid to late 50s. And then Catholicism, sort of late 40s. But the only ones that are the three youngest demographics is Eastern Orthodoxy, Islam, and Hinduism in the United States. So that is a huge metric, in my opinion, if you're going to speculate about the future, that's where most of the energy is going to be, because that's where the young people are still part of those institutions. And so I've been vocal on stream saying that I think Protestantism in a way it's already failed. It's in a process of generational collapse. Because how are they going to save America when, after the boomers are gone, or especially Gen X, who's going to be there?
Yeah. So let me say a couple of things on that. Number one is that the mainline Protestant church, I mean, the liberal Protestant church, they're kind of DOA at this point. Like, they are just dead on arrival for the most part. They are losing people like crazy. The second thing is a more scholarly point. Berman has, in the article that I mentioned about the history of revolutions, he connects various revolutions with transformations of religion, right? So the Reformation is the Protestant Revolution. Then he gets to the Revolutionary period, the American and French revolutions. The religious shift there is deism. The Russian Revolution, the religious shift is to atheism. And you know, I've asked myself, okay, if you think that there's revolutions that are happening and there's religious shifts that occur within them, you know, what's the next religious shift, right? If we're living through some kind of revolutionary time, particularly in the last decade, like, what kind of religion now ascends? And just looking at it today, I'd look at Europe, for example, and I think, okay, Islam is clearly getting bigger.
Yeah.
Right. The occult is clearly getting bigger as its own kind of religious form.
And Druidism, I think, are the fastest growing in England.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
Outside of Islam, of course.
yeah, outside of Islam. So you've got Islam, and you've got occultism, and then you've got orthodoxy. Yeah. Right. Orthodoxy is and in my mind, it's like, okay, if there's another revolution, because modernity has these cycles of revolution, you know, what religion comes next? And is this, obviously I'm Orthodox, so I hope it's orthodoxy,
Right.
but these are the forms that seem to be growing at the time, at right now. So,
And regarding the rise in the occult and paganism, I've made the claim that this has to do with the problems of modernity itself. Not that the average person is even conscious of this, but
yeah,
I always describe the 5 pillars of modernity as individualism, rationalism, scientism, technological progress, and democracy. And that really, those things define the modern period. And the promise of modernity, the carrot that got people to go forward was that every generation was going to be successively better and that the opportunities would emerge. Well, that is certainly not true for my generation, the millennials, or the Gen Z generation after me. The prospects of owning a home, the difficulties of finding a wife, career opportunities, being able to make enough money to become financially successful or not be stressed out about money in certain ways, much more difficult. And so I think young people, and that's why when you look at what religions are young people flocking to, I've made the argument that it's pre-modern faith systems. So Orthodoxy being one, trad Catholicism, but I even during my defense of my dissertation, I had a Aristotelian professor, and she does like person and neuroscience theories, philosophy of mind type stuff. And she asked me when I was presenting, she said, well, I have one question. Why do you claim that Orthodoxy is pre-modern and you're comparing it and contrasting with Catholicism? Catholicism is clearly pre-modern. And my point was, really, well, after Vatican II, and you start looking at all these different, can you really claim that Catholicism is still a pre-modern orientation? And she even conceded. She's like, well, you make a good point. So paganism, right? You look at some of the right-wing political movements, and they're promoting like Nordic, Germanic, Druidic paganism, these type of things. So it's the occult, it's Islam, which is pre-modern, and there's Orthodoxy. And I think that subconsciously or unconsciously, people are trying to find an escape of modernity. And I argue that transhumanism is the endpoint of the modernist project. And so I think when you're talking about these political revolutions, if they adopt paganism, I don't see that as contrasting with this idea of technological augmentation or that technology is going to liberate us. I really see those in tandem. And when you look at some of these transhumanist religions, they speak very occultic about what they believe and the point of man, or even, Crowley's Thelema about the will and manifesting the will, and that in the virtual reality or the augmentation of the human body, your will be able to dictate and fulfill all the desires that your heart once. So that's why I would thinking about where the revolution is going. Protestantism, I believe, is collapsing under its own weight to some degree, and it's generational.
There's another scholar, Robert Bella, who's a sociologist from the second half of the 20th. Robert Bella? Yeah. So Bella writes at one point in one of his essays that Protestantism may end up being a kind of liminal state, or like a throughway, because before it, you have pre-modern things. After it, you have secularism,
right?
And he's a liberal Protestant saying this, right? He just sort of realizes that it's a transitional phase towards something else.
Yeah.
And I tend to agree with him on that Protestantism is insolvent enough that people will move out from it as they have already on the mainline level, right? Because, if you've got the Democratic Party, you don't really need a mainline church for the most part. You know what I mean?
Well, and the way they present their ideas are very much in a sort of spiritual religious rhetoric.
Yeah, very much.
And it mirrors Christianity. The whole idea, but many social justice is the love of Christ, right? We have to deal with the injustice. They very much repackage Christianity in a digestible, progressive form.
Yeah, well, I mean, history has these examples, right? So if you think about camp meetings during the Second Great Awakening, I mean, these are like 1810 examples of Woodstock. You know what I mean? Like, people go out, seriously, people go out in the woods for a few days. They're having a party. There's really entertaining preachers out there, and souls are getting saved. And, this is in Hatch's book, by the way, which again is great. But like, it's very similar, and the elites are like aghast at it because they feel like it's just totally out of control, But yeah, completely. I mean, secularization theory is that, the basic pattern and ethos continues past the religious affiliation. So the religious affiliation goes away, but you've still got the spirit of your grandparents in your veins. You're just not going to church with it now.
Right. No, and that's what I appeal to Taylor and Habermas's theory of the post-secular society, or the post-secular turn. That, Mircea Eliade, famous, was talking about how man is not Homo sapien or Homo sapien sapien, he's Homo religious. And that is the foundation of what man actually is. And I've seen Father Josiah Trenum make this argument that man can't help but be religious. It's just, what do you put as your ultimate value structure? And so in my book, I argue the reason why I think, projecting into the future, that the conflict in Western civilization, assuming that Islam doesn't just take over much of Europe, that it's going to be between the pre-modern theosis of orthodoxy and the apotheosis of transhumanism or technology. And that in the post-secular turn, there is no delineate. You don't have to use Ninian Smart's 7 dimensions of religion to argue that something is religious. That in the post-secular turn, everything is about ultimate meaning construction. So what is your ultimate meaning? So it doesn't matter if you're a Marxist, doesn't matter if you're a transhuman. They're all religious orientations during the post-secular turn. And Charles Taylor and Habermas hammered this down in the 20th century. And I think it's true.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. And I think that the connection you were making earlier between transhumanism and the occult is just really interesting. And it seems very much to make sense that, speaking as a Southerner with certain stereotypes, it really seems like a California thing. You know what I mean? Like, if there's people out there, they're following this, and both the movement towards transhumanism and the leanings towards the occult are there in the same region geographically, as a kind of hub or center for its development. You know what I mean? It's really interesting. It's really interesting. And I'm inclined to agree with you. I'm inclined to think, my immediate response is, you've got movements towards things that are highly traditional. And then you've got really the next step in the advance of progress, which is completely beyond Protestantism. Right. And
how could Protestantism deal with where, Western civilization is moving towards? And this once the internet comes in to place, we've seen this perpetual decline. And I think, again, this subconscious or unconscious movement of people is that they're fleeing for something that is pre-modern, which means it's mystical, it's communal, it's not individualistic, it's not limited by rationalism. Science does not define all of epistemology. And this is why, at first, the most appealing, I think, is trad Catholicism. But that's why you see this general progression towards orthodoxy, that maybe I'll become Catholic because it's still Western. I don't have to give up my European or feel like I'm no longer, Italian or French ancestry. But then you get into the Catholic Church and you're not escaping the problems. In fact, the Catholic Church is moving forward with it. We see Chrislam in Abu Dhabi, the Abrahamic Faith Center, where they have the synagogue, the mosque, and the Catholic Church representing the faith of the future, the Abrahamic Faith Center. Well, that's ecumenism. Well, that's moving towards, again, perennialism. That means a further dissolution of boundaries. That's exactly what I say. I argue that is the occult psychedelic trajectory of the future. That's why we can't even say man's not an animal or a man is not a woman. All boundaries are dissolving. When you see Antifa march, no border, no wall, no USA at all. What is that? It's not just political. It's that there's a mentality of the dissolution of boundaries as somehow the liberation of mankind itself.
And see, I think, looking at that from an Aristotelian lens, right? Everything is a body. He uses the body image all the time, right? And a body that has no boundaries is, again, a dead body, right? The body has to have some sort of limit in order to take shape, right? And so, my answer to that is that if you see the scriptures in terms of work and rest and how they limit each other, then this is the basic practical form of limitation. It's not necessarily a theological limitation, but it's a practical form of limitation. But no, to get back to what you're saying about modernity, I mean, I agree. It's just really fascinating to think about how the limits have just faded, and so much of our struggle is how to rediscover them. I meant to ask you, when people are looking at orthodoxy, what part do you think the moral example of the saints plays in that? Because you listed a bunch of things that draw people to orthodoxy. I think, and coming out of a military context, like, you're supposed to look up to your officers. They're supposed to be good soldiers, or your high-ranking NCOs. You're supposed to look up to those guys, and there are sort of heroes of the faith, right?
Right.
And what do you think the example of saints plays into that? Because here are people that live meaningful lives. Pick your favorite 20th century saint, St. John Maximovich, or St. Paisios, or St. Sophrony, or whoever. What do you think about that and how it's playing in? Do you think it's significant, or do you think it's one of the lesser factors?
I think it's significant for people that already come to the church. So I think the lives of the saints is from, and just this is my engagement with mostly young men, but general people, but mostly young men that I talk to, is the catalyst for orthodoxy tend to be theodicy. First, the recognition, if they weren't Christian or they left Christianity, it's the recognition that there's evil. And then that sets them on a journey of trying to figure out what's the opposite. Usually means Christ, then means which one, then through history and theology, it must be orthodoxy. And once they get to the church, the lives of the saints, and Father Peter hears is, he's always hammering people, once you convert, read the lives of the saints. Now they do have role models. I've been big on promoting a lot of the warrior saints, St. Constantine, St. Stephen the Great, that then you can see what is masculinity, for example. Like that we just had 2022, 2023 was the red pill manosphere explosion, right? Men trying to deal with the ailings of feminism. And much of their prescription, though their description of Western civilization is accurate, what are the prescriptions they offer? Well, you must make as much money as you can. You need to get the nice car. You got to make sure that you look smacks and that you're the best looking version that you can possibly. Well, it's appealing to the sentiments of the women that they're criticizing, right? So instead of changing the game and flipping the game board over and saying, I'm not going to play the feminist game of, they talk about hypergamy, that women are always looking for the next best option. Well, their solution to that is not to return to tradition, to allow God's providence become, a man of God and allow God's providence to bring the right person in your life. Well, if that's the game, well, then you got to become the best version that she'll never leave you because she couldn't do better or something to that degree.
Yeah.
So the lives of the saints offer an example. What is a man? A man is someone who takes on responsibility. A man is something that serves the collective. A man is not focused on himself. Every great man of history was self-sacrificial, indicative of Christ being the representative of what man's telos is. And so I think a lot of people, and most of the young men I've spoke with, their first entry into the church wasn't necessarily through reading the lives of the saints, but I see the transformation of them and their phronema and becoming more orthodox that's how you do it. Obviously, you learn the theology, but if you just have all the rational understandings of the energy essence distinction, the logos logi distinction, all this stuff, well, it's all rational. Orthodoxy is mystical. It's a lived experience. And that way, getting into the lives of the saints, now you have real spiritual role models. And I think that is something that Protestantism often can't provide.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think that Protestantism lacks the role models in general. I mean, it certainly lacked them when I was a child, or when I was younger, to be a sort of role model Protestant was to be a good speaker, a good preacher, maybe, or to know your theology. But Orthodoxy, it seems to me in practice, and I've been Orthodox for 14 years now, something like that. Orthodoxy strikes me, as much as anything else, as a habit of prayer and a habit of thought. That is what you are doing.
Yeah.
So yes, there are disciplines involved, there are rules involved. All of that stuff is important. It has its place. But it's a habit of prayer and a habit of thought.
Yeah.
And so to learn to be Orthodox is to learn the habit of prayer and the habit of thought. And so when I say habit of thought, I mean the internal struggle, like figuring out that, oh, I'm thinking complaining thoughts, or I'm thinking angry thoughts towards someone, or I'm, getting down on myself mentally, and realizing that those are temptations, like having the self-awareness to see that and to stop it, saying prayers or whatever, or, I'm thinking hateful things about this person or whatever, that prayer plays into that. I think prayer helps us have the consciousness of that. But I think, if you want to say, well, orthodoxy is something that's going to help us be better men, which I definitely think it will. I still think fundamentally the practice is prayer. Like, what does it mean to pray? And
totally agree with you.
And the saints.
I don't mean that I diminish prayer in any way.
I don't think you were. I don't think you were.
Okay.
No, I'm just trying to throw my 2 cents in, man. But I think the saints are so good because they exemplify it for us. It's not just a book that says, here's how you should pray, or like reading the scriptures and Jesus went out into the wilderness to pray. Okay. Like, no, you've actually got people who recently in the last century can show you and talk to you. I mean, the little snippets that are online, whatever, all the
Saint Sophrony.
Yeah. So helpful.
I have his book on prayer.
Yeah. So good. So helpful. So anyway.
No, I told you, and that was what Father Michael Marcantoni, he's a Greek Orthodox priest in Tennessee, came on last week, and we talked about spiritual warfare, and that was his whole thing, is that one of his criticisms of Protestantism or American Christianity in general is that it externalizes spiritual warfare. And that Orthodox, we have to realize that you're the one that is being acted upon. You're the one that the demon is acting through. You are the vessel of spiritual warfare. It's not out here, it's in here. And that's why the prayer is so important. He said, what are you concerned about? What's going on, complaining about the Epstein client list or anything that happened if you can't even keep your prayer rule?
Yeah, precisely. That sums it up so well, that like if you're into current events, the news feed can be like, you can look at it daily or whatever. It could just be your daily fix, or you can do it for hours if you want to. But if you're doing that and you're not keeping your prayer rule, then the priorities are not in line where they should be. The prayer rule should come first in some way. I mean, I read something recently from St. Theophan where he says, it's good to do a few prostrations here and there throughout your day. Whenever you have a moment, if you're able, stop and do just a few prostrations just to sort of reset your mind, and like, really, it takes a certain, like, you have to be able to do it. I mean, you can't do that if you're in an office full of people, right?
Right. You don't want to be the Pharisee.
Yeah, you can't do that. But it's a really good thing to do just for like getting your mind focused in the right direction,
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Green Emperor had a question for you. Throw in $10. Thank you very much. Master and Margarita profile pic. That's a great book. Could you explain the issue with forensic justification? I have been seeing a lot of Protestants lately say they are being strawmanned about this issue, with them saying that it is not a legal fiction.
Well, okay. Forensic justification basically means that the justification is external, like it's placed on you, as opposed to internal transformation, right? That, I guess, is the argument. That perspective is what they're saying is a straw man. Because I've heard Lutherans say, there's an ontological transformation, but to be honest with you, I don't know. Okay. Luther says that you appropriate Christ for you and for me, which means there is some kind of experience that you're supposed to have. In my opinion, that experience is, I was under so much pressure under the law, and now I'm released from that. And there is a certain emotional experience that goes on with that, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that kind of experience, like, let's say you allow that and you say, well, that's forensic justification. It does involve a kind of religious experience, so it is therefore not a legal fiction. But does it involve the kind of moral transformation that you see in orthodoxy? Like, no, orthodoxy is a lifetime of transformation that is meant to be salvific, in which particularly the experiences of prayer open doors to the experience of God over a lifetime, right? So it's a much more long-standing kind of habit. It's not a single experience. I hope I'm getting at the question well there.
Well,
I think
that
you're just looking at two fundamentally different forms of religious experience, right? The very sort of, early modern, Reformation and post-Reformation up to the First and Second Great Awakening kind of religious experience is based on coming under this pressure and then the pressure being released, and you have an experience of that, right? There is a kind of release that's involved, and it can be very joyous, right? I'm sure Luther was very happy after his tower experience. But what orthodoxy is getting at is something very different, because you are striving by the grace of God to be a cleansed vessel that the Holy Spirit can inhabit.
Right.
And that happens over years.
Right.
So that I think it happens over years. Maybe for some people it happens really quickly.
I don't know anyone that's had an immediate cleansing in which that occurred.
Yes. But it's an experience that builds into the future, not something that happens at the beginning and then you sort of look back at, so it's a really different form of religious experience. But I would not say forensic justification is a legal fiction to the extent that it involves a real experience. There's a real emotional event that happens. I just think the form of that event.
And my follow-up question for you is, and I really don't know the answer to this, what is the technicalities in which one is ontologically transformed in their theology? We have the energy essence distinction, and that can be explicated, and you can understand how the ontological transformation happens. Thomistic theology, they have the analogia entis, and so you're not really engaging directly with God's love. There's an analogy in which you're participating in for your sanctification. For Protestantism, what is it that is? Are they directly engaging with God? I mean, I've heard people say that they think that the Holy Spirit's indwelling in them and giving them, but for those that are the articulators of their theological paradigm, what is the mechanism in that which is actually happening?
I've studied the Lutheran pietists before who are very big on internal experience, but they're more like devotional writers for the most part. They're not theologians, so they're not like thematizing logically what it is that their experience as I remember them. So I don't want to speak of something that I don't know. I have not encountered some sort of systematic exposition of what this experience is along the lines of theosis or analogia entis or energy essences. That's not to say it's not there. Okay. So it may be there and I just haven't encountered it, but I haven't encountered it myself.
Okay. And Lockstep threw in 5 no comment. Thank you very much, brother. And K. Gifted a Codal Crew membership along with becoming a member. Thank you very much, K. And 270 Ortho Bro says it's not much, but it's something, brother. I appreciate your content. Well, thank you, man. I really appreciate that. And on Dono Chat, Matt Scroggins, member of the Logos Academy, says, sorry, it's not more. Best I can do right now. Threw in $5. Says, great stream. Thank you, Dr. Cantey. So I think that's it, unless anyone has any questions. Major thank you to you coming on and presenting this. I actually hope that some of the Lutherans or some of the Reformed apologists hear it, and I'd be very curious to see what their response arguments are and how they poke holes in your presentation, because one, it's novel, it's not simplistic, it's not your run-of-the-mill criticism of Protestantism, sola scriptura, subjectivism. It's historical, and then it's philosophical in regards to the canon law, and I really love that approach because it's something that I told you both privately on the phone and today that I underappreciated in my investigation of intellectual history. And so I'm very interested in getting into some of the books that you referenced to learn a little bit more about that and its impact on Western civilization.
Okay. Well, yeah, I hope you found them helpful, and I hope everybody who watched, I hope this has been good for you. So,
all right. Well, and also just for clarity, I pulled the book up, but guys, go get 1 John revised and extended on Docetism and the resurrection. You can get that with this link right here. I will share it in the live chat. And is there anything else you'd want to promote? Anything that why we have the audience or anybody watches this in the future in which they could?
If you are in the Southeast, I'm going to be talking at the Ludwell conference in September.
Oh, nice.
So there's a handful of other folks that are going to be speaking there. Dr. David Bradshaw is going to be there. Jay Dyer is going to be talking. A few other folks are going to be talking, and I'm going to be giving a talk on the Garden of Eden and the state of nature.
Oh, very cool.
So that should be fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. Do appreciate you coming here and spending the time, giving us your time and the willingness to put a fantastic presentation together. So thank you very much. Guys, smash that like, and I will be back potentially tomorrow, or if not, definitely Friday. We have a sponsored stream that I'm preparing for on Bolshevik communist persecution of Orthodox Christians. So I'm trying to put all that together.
Nice. That's good. That's worth tuning into.
Definitely. Yeah, well, there's so much there. I was once I began the research, a little overwhelmed because where do you start? You know, you got our Nicholas, the Holodomor, the Patesti experiments in Romania.
Yeah.
There's so much to cover. So I may just do like a general overview. And the gentleman who requested it asked to read Father Arseni's book and his time in the gulags, which I have not done. So I got to get into that as well. So that's why it may be pushed back a few days while I try to just cover more ground before getting on here and talking about it. But
I'll be sure to watch it when it comes out.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks again for coming today. So thank you all for the support. Thanks everyone who tuned in, and I will see you in the next one. As always, until then, God bless.